Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast.
Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And in that spiritual adventure realm, allows me to broaden my purview of the world and how we evolve and sort of how we get to where we are. I think of astrology as a foundational instructional methodology for understanding who we are, but I also see it as a way for us to encounter and understand how we may become preloaded in some way as we enter into this world. That's one of the things that astrology, I think, brings to our table, is the ability to sort of address the fact that we sort of did come with a preloaded set of attributes. I've got a fascinating guest coming on in a few minutes, and I'll get to that in just a second. I want to remind you about my newsletter, which goes out every Sunday afternoon. In there, you'll find an overview of what's going on the planet with regards to all of us, as well as the individual signs. I encourage you to read your sun sign as well as your rising sign, and you'll get much more accuracy that way for the types of events and the theme of the events that will be occurring in your life in the week to come. This is what's most important about astrology. So anyway, without further ado, my next guest is Mark Wolynn. He's written a book that caught my attention right away called It Didn't Start With You: How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. Now, Mark is a celebrated psychologist. He's the founder of and director of the Family Constellation Institution. He has taught at the University of Pittsburgh, the Western Psychiatric Institute, Kripalu, the Omega Institute, New York Open Center, and the California Institute of Integral Studies, in addition to many training centers, clinics, and hospitals. His articles have appeared in Psychology Today, marivaschreiber.com, and he's 2016 winner of the Nautilus Book Award in Psychology. So he's a highly regarded, highly educated and influential psychologist. And this book caught my attention immediately because of just the simple title. It Didn't Start With You. So welcome to the show today, Mark. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned, the title, well, when we work with astrology, we sort of cast a chart that's based on a birth date, place, and time, and that gives us a set of attributes that we sort of carry with us. I always refer to it as our owner's manual. In your approach as a psychologist, your postulate is that we come into this world with a sense of being preloaded as well, and that preloaded is part of our family inheritance. And I'm curious how you came to this idea and what you have to sort of set the stage for that topic.
So many years ago, I was seeing clients, and the context of their symptoms was missing. So they'd have symptoms, but you couldn't find it in life experience. You'd look back in the childhood, you'd look back at attachment with the mother, you'd look back in the relationship with the parents, and it wasn't to be seen. And I remember my very first case that led me in this direction. I was working with a cutter, and she was a young woman who would cut so deeply. She would hit vessels and nearly bleed to death, which didn't make sense. Each time she would cut, she would end up in the hospital to stop the blood loss. And so strange characteristic or strange symptom number one, why was she cutting so deeply? Mm-hmm. And I asked her, what are you thinking about in that moment right before you cut? And she looked at me and said, I deserve to die? And here is this 24-year-old woman whose life has just begun. And I said to her, well, what did you do? Did you take somebody's life? Did you harm somebody? Did you feel responsible? She said nothing like that. So looking in the only places I knew back then, we're talking 20-some years ago, I looked into childhood, looked at her relationship with her parents, looked at childhood events, looked at attachment with her mother. Everything was stellar. And then I asked this question: what happened in your family history? Tell me about your grandmother, grandfather. And boom, she drops the bomb. Her grandmother was an alcoholic, driving the car drunk, and Grandpa was in the front seat. And Grandma hit into a telephone pole. She lived, but Grandpa went through the glass and got cut and bled to death before the ambulance arrived. And then that feeling of the client, I deserve to die, was not hers at all. We made an interesting link just in that story alone, that when she cut herself, when she nearly bled to death, it was connected with the grandfather. When she felt she deserved to die, it wasn't her feeling at all. It was her grandmother's, which this put me on a search looking for into the family history as to what's going on. And my discoveries, like yours, have led me to know that we are absolutely preloaded in an epigenetic, biological way with the way our genes will ignite in some direction, either turning on or turning off, turning up, turning down, activating, silencing, based on traumas. And
did this woman know her grandparents before they had this problem?
No, actually, she didn't. Her dad was 12 when the grandfather died, and the mother died when the father was 20, and she wasn't born, of course, until the father was somewhere in his 30s. She didn't know them, nor was the story talked about.
But the imprint was there, and in
exactly.
him, the imprint was there. The message was there, and it left a scar on him.
Exactly, a biological imprint.
Right, yeah.
And this was what was inherited.
It's fascinating.
And I would have cases like this, yeah. And so after a while, I started to seek teachers that would teach in this direction. I ended up with a great teacher in Germany called Bert Hellinger, a brilliant man who teaches something called family constellations. And that was been studying with Bert since about 2000.
Well, it's interesting because we do see these patterns in our own lives. We are a composite of what formed us. I would imagine that's safe to say. We've got little bits of our mother and little bits of our father in us, and those personality traits, be they good or bad, are bound to appear in us some way. And I guess it's a matter of how we reconcile. That's part of your work, right?
Yeah, we're talking about biologically inherited traumas. So when a trauma happens to, let's say, our grandparents, they're changed. Literally, there's a chemical change in the DNA, and this changes how the genes function, sometimes for generations, as much as 3 or more generations. A chemical tag will attach to the DNA and tell a cell to use or ignore a certain gene, and then the way the genes are affected changes how our grandparents will act or feel. For example, they'll become reactive to the situation they're experiencing, and then that can be, so they can deal with it better, and then that can be passed on through the gene changes. For example, if grandma and grandpa come from a war-torn country, let's say, they'll develop a skill set of sharper reflexes, quicker reaction times, and this skill set, this very skill set, they can pass forward to help us survive the trauma they experienced. The problem is we can also inherit a stress response with the dials set to 10, prepared for a catastrophe that never arrives. We're not born in the same war-torn environment, and now we have the continuous stress of being hypervigilant or hyper-aroused from this war trauma that our parents or grandparents experienced, and they pass this skill set forward to us, or this stress response forward to us, and we can pass that stress response forward to our children. We want to believe we're born with a clean hard drive, but we're not. There's, to use a computer analogy, there's an operating system already in place that contains the fallout from not only our traumas, but our parents' traumas, our grandparents' traumas. And then we are born, and our kids can be born with fears and feelings and reactions and sensitivities that didn't originate. Well, like the title of the book, it didn't start with you.
It's fascinating because I've always held that same premise that we are sort of, I always use the hard drive as a analogy for our brains and ourselves. So it's interesting that we share that common thread. And it does make sense logically when you think about it. When it comes to, you mentioned traumatic experiences. Is there any way, I know this is a difficult question, is there any way to measure how far back this goes? I mean, how far back and genetically this goes? I'm sure that it gets diluted in some ways. This characteristic would get diluted if you had a relative in the Civil War, perhaps, and that you evolve from there. You're talking about 150, 120 years later. How far back do you think this goes?
Actually, it's studied, Chris. Because they can get a generation of mice in 12 to 20 weeks, and mice share 99% of the same genetic makeup as humans, which means 99% of our genes have counterparts in mice. 80% or so are identical. So they can do studies on mice and pretty much tell us that 3 generations for sure. Although I just saw a study the other day showing 14 generations in a particular type of worm. So, I'll tell you, this is one particular study with mice that's so intriguing. They took mice and they had them experience a cherry blossom, and they did this at Emory Medical University in Atlanta. They had them experience a cherry blossom scent, but each time the mice smelled the scent, they shocked them. So they paired the experience of smelling it with this pain, the shock, and after a while the mice had epigenetic changes. They had enlarged areas in their brain where there would be more smell receptors, so they could detect this smell at lesser concentrations, thereby protecting themselves. They found it in the blood and the brain also, in the sperm. So they take the sperm and they inject it into female mice that weren't shocked. What they found in the next 2 generations was pretty astounding. They found that the pups and the grandpups, just by smelling the cherry blossom scent, became all jittery and jumpy and freaking out, never having experienced the trauma. That's us. We're born with that stress response, but we didn't experience our parents' or grandparents' trauma directly. There's another study that shows it's 3 generations is the best they can figure. They did this study at the Brain Institute at the University of Zurich, where they separated male mice from their mothers, and they could track the changes, the biological changes, in this case microRNAs, a high incidence of microRNAs, which is a genetic material that affects gene expression. They could track this in the brain for 3 generations, but not beyond that. So they had the experience. They had the experience could be felt for 3 generations, but they suspected, because they didn't have the physiologic changes in that 3rd generation, that it wouldn't be passed beyond that. But then this thing with 14 generations with mice really gives pause to wonder.
Yeah, that certainly adds a lot to it, because if you think of it, getting back to the analogy of a hard drive, there's going to be strains of incidents on there that are like circuits that I suppose. Would you think this might explain deja vu in some way, whereby we may have had a feeling of being someplace before because of the simple fact that part of that data may be part of our preborn hard drive or our delivered hard drive? So
that I couldn't say. That I've not thought about.
It would make sense, right? In some ways, if you have a feeling like I've been here before, that could very well have been a inherited experience that you brought forth from a former generation. Right?
It would make sense, because we would have a reaction to the stimuli that our grandparents, for example, if grandma, let's say, was raped, and we carry in our body that feeling of her rape, it would make sense that the large guy, or whatever the factors were in that experience, we could have a sensitivity to as well. It would make sense.
And we're mostly speaking here about traumatic experiences. I imagine that the same is true for just about any characteristic. If there was a strong propensity in a grandparent for music or art or or even a great grandparent or a writer, wouldn't those same characteristics also filter their way up through the gene as opposed to just the traumatic events?
It's such a good question, and again, I'm blank on the answer because I don't know. I just look at inherited family trauma. You would assume so, but the way I see it is, what changes the gene expression is what gets my interest. Mm-hmm. So certain traumas are potent enough to change the way that our genes will function, and this can last for generations. But it sure makes sense that we would inherit the good as well as the bad. But I will say this, some of the gene changes we inherit are not negative. What gets passed forward is a reaction to help us survive, which makes us stronger. Mm-hmm. For instance, that skill set Grandma and Grandpa passed forward with the sharp reflexes and the quicker reaction times is not negative.
Right. But it would also, the events as they unfold would have to unfold at a point in time prior to procreation. In other words, the story you gave to me initially, the boy was 12 years old when his father was killed in the car accident. He had not yet procreated. So that imprint of that experience was firmly part of his memory cluster, so that when he went to procreate, that may have been passed on at that point. So the timing of these events is a critical indicator into the outcome. Correct?
Correct. The male sperm line continues to change up until conception. Mm-hmm. So, of course, it would be affected. Now, the female, that's interesting here, the female egg stops dividing when our mother is 5 months a fetus in Grandma's womb. And one of those eggs is us. So you could say another way, too, and embryologists have known this for over 100 years, that we share the same biological environment with our mother inside Grandma's womb because we're one of those eggs.
So inside the womb. So we go back at least that far, at least to the grandmother.
Exactly. At least that far, mm-hmm. We go back into Grandma's womb, where our egg is being affected inside Mom's womb while she's a fetus. So that that's another mode of possible transfer of these emotional experiences.
And then when that woman matures and gets to the age where she wants to marry or procreate, mm-hmm. that further dilutes it in some way. If you're just like taking equal parts of taking two equal parts of something and putting it together, you're going to get a variation of that. You've got an A component, you've got a B component, the A being the male, the B being the female.
Yeah.
Then when they combine, do you get an AB component or do you get a C
exactly. component? We carry remnants, residue of our parents' experience, both sides.
Interesting.
A boy can carry his father's as well as his mother's. A girl can carry her father's as well as her mother's.
So it's a variation of that. But the outcome is an A-B combination as opposed to a C combination, correct? Do you follow my logic there?
I want to be sure that I do.
Yeah. So you have
a C component. Explain to me what a C component is, so I can answer.
So let's say, so A is the father, B is the mother, C would be presumably the child. So is the outcome of the A and the B, which would be the father and the mother, is that a composite which would then be an AB characteristic, or is that a C quality? In other words, the individual born of the two people becomes an entity unto themselves.
I do understand, and this I can't speak to.
Right.
What I can say is
I often think about this in astrology because it seems as if there are variants of that where you do have the AB, because we are a composite as supported by your evidence and your information and your research, that we become a composite of both. So we have strains of both the father and the mother in us, which makes perfect sense, which is why diseases are transmitted, and our genetics are also part of that as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting. There's studies done at the Mount Sinai Medical in New York with a neuroscientist named Rachel Yehuda, where she found that survivors and their parents, so this isn't mice, this is humans, not only share the same traumatic experiences and the compromised cortisol levels, etc., from the trauma, parent and child. She finds that we carry the same gene changes. For example, the survivors carry the same gene changes in the exact same region of the very same gene. Technically, she studied the FKBP5 gene. For all the listeners who know their genes, and you know it's interesting. They can show this in humans. She's an interesting sentence. She says that we are 3 times more likely to have post-traumatic stress disorder if one of our parents had PTSD. And then as a result, we have a propensity to struggle with depression and anxiety. Think about that. If one of our parents has PTSD, we have 3 times more likely a chance to also share it.
And that would have to happen prior to our birth. That stress or that PTSD you're referring to would have to happen prior to conception. No. So it could be observed through
our mothers. The work of Bruce Lipton, which is interesting, and the work of Rachel Yehuda showed that while children were gestating, when she's a great study of the World Trade Center attacks and the effects on pregnant mothers and their fetuses. So these babies, if the mother went on to develop PTSD, so did the baby. There were 16 different genetic markers in these children, and that they were smaller for their gestational age, and they were affected by mother's trauma. And that also goes back to the work of Bruce Lipton, who says that a mother's emotions can biologically affect the child by altering gene expression. So her trauma is in utero.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, because you think about it, here you've got a baby, metaphorically speaking, in process, in the factory, and any impetus or influence that comes to that baby while in gestation would definitely leave an imprint on the child. That makes perfect sense to me.
There's a video called In Utero by Jake Gyllenhaal's father and stepmother. Stephen and Catherine Gyllenhaal have this video, which is you can get online on Amazon, whatever, brilliant, showing the effects on us in utero, in our mom's womb, her stressors, how it affects us, and turns, again, genetic expression and our psychological, emotional constitution.
And that's got to have an impact on a generational level as well, because you think about our current, most mothers today, when they're pregnant, work almost until they're ready to pop. And so if they're in a stressful work environment, or even if they're just in a work environment, period, getting up, getting dressed, getting out the door, getting on the train, getting to work, sitting there while they're pregnant, all of those are going to have an impact much different than, say, the post-World War II baby boomer mothers who were home making the chicken dinner in the kitchen while their husband worked all day long, and they're in a safe environment, much different than the woman of today. That's got to have a different generational impact as well.
We need to find a way to support mothers during pregnancy, maybe more maternity leave or just emotional support and whatever. After learning, as I've learned about the effects of a stressful pregnancy, it can have effects on the children. Yes, we need to find ways to do it.
Yeah, I would think so. And it's a fascinating subject, because it does make sense that we would be a byproduct of our parents. That, to me, makes complete sense, and that supports sort of the logic of what I find in astrology. Do you think of the brain, in this case, as a circuit board? We've used the analogy of a hard drive, which makes perfect sense to me, but a circuit board where some circuits have gone awry based on this experience, and therefore, since they are just like a motherboard in a computer, they can be repaired.
Absolutely.
They can be repaired by reburning, rechanneling, reburning those circuits so that they take on a different thing, which is part of the role of the PTSD, and what I understand to be EMDR, correct? Is that EMDR is the right word? You're familiar with that, right? That's the
yes, of course.
Where you reburn your circuits, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are many ways, including EMDR, to have brain change. And, maybe we can focus on this. I have quite a bit to say about how we change.
We'll get to that in the second half of the show. I do want to ask a little more about, now, when you people come to these conclusions, and if they know their past, do you have examples of people who may have had traumatic who have had past generational traumatic experiences who did not manifest the same sort of
Absolutely. If this is a funny analogy, but if your family history is a 12-cut piece of pizza, the first child will take these 2 cuts, the second child will take these 2 cuts, the third child that cut. In other words, we don't all manifest the same trauma as siblings in our family history. It's as though each child in some way carries an aspect of either the same trauma or different traumas in the family history. Sometimes I've seen where the first boy is likely to carry his father's trauma or what's unfinished in his father's experience. And the first girl sometimes can carry her mother's trauma or what's unfinished in her experience. But this isn't necessarily always the case. It can be reversed. Mm-hmm. And only children, single children, can carry both from mother and father what's unresolved. I have this sentence I sometimes like to say: the children express what's unresolved between the parents, what's unresolved behind the parents, or they can mirror to us the parents, what we have long ago suppressed. In other words, they can express the feelings that we've shut down.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, if a person is a frustrated musician and their child then goes on to become a musician, that seems to be a logical sort of transfer of power, so to speak. In other words, the child lives the parent's dream. Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Well, I don't know that we can say that would be biological, but that can be explained in some form of unconscious loyalty, mm-hmm. that a parent can act out what a child can act out what a parent leaves incomplete.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow, fascinating. Well, before we're going to take a quick break now. Before we do, is there a website where people can get to you personally that discusses this? I know your book is available on Amazon. We're talking today with Mark Wolynn. He's the author of It Didn't Start With You: How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. And if you have a website, I'd love to put that out there as well.
Yes, please. www.mark with a K, Wolynn, WOLYNN.com.
Great. Okay,
I'm also on Facebook as well.
Okay, great. We'll take a quick break, and we're going to get back to this fascinating discussion, which I think dovetails so nicely with astrology. It really fascinates. So we'll be back in about 2.5 minutes. I encourage you to look into Mark's website as well as his book, It Didn't Start With You: How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. We'll be back in about 2.5 minutes, so hang in there. What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
As the world shrinks and our barriers come down, diverse cultures are striving for harmony, balance, and peace. To ease the transition, we need to expand with color, light, and tolerance. Now, you can become a global citizen and embrace the color and clear spirit with the divine artwork of the mandala. Mandalas are a timeless artistic offering for creating unity, harmony, and peace. My name is Chris Flisher, and I've spent years creating mandalas, and they are now available online at www.turningofthewheel.com. Come and experience the world of color, form, and function with t-shirts, coffee mugs, note cards, and limited edition prints. These vibrant, lively paintings and products express optimism, oneness, and spiritual balance for all who use them. www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. And enter a world of possibility and color. Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My guest today is Mark Wolynn. He's the founder and director of the Family Constellation Institute and fascinating author of a book called It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. The reason this subject caught my eye was because I love the idea of the synergy and the common roles that astrology and, in this case, our genetic sort of predisposition dovetail so well with each other. It certainly makes sense to me on a very logical level. And that's why it's been great to have this conversation with Mark today, and I appreciate you very much coming on. We were talking before the break about inherited trauma, and I'm curious, how do you go about identifying this in an individual? If someone comes to you or enters into your realm, how do you sort of identify this as perhaps being part of this? Is this necessarily always the case that a person who is predisposed, as your initial example of someone cutting themselves, is there always a direct link to a trauma in the past? Or can these kinds of situations or people or characteristics in a person manifest from their own personal traumas that they've experienced? And how do you distinguish?
So people find their way to me because they're struggling with anxiety or depression or phobias, and I follow the trauma language. For example, in my book, when readers read the book, I lead people to discover what their own personal trauma language that they carry within their symptom picture. So, for example, in a fear, someone carries a fear that they'll harm someone, or a fear that they'll be rejected, or a fear that they'll go crazy. In their anxiety and their depression, I look for what I call core language. And core language can be verbal. For example, the language of trauma that is part of this biological residue that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. But it can also be repetition of life experience. For example, somebody keeps shooting themselves in the foot the same way, making the same movements, the same type of self-sabotage, the same type of destructive choices, stepping in the same potholes over and over again, as though that too is forming a language. For example, why do we keep doing the same thing? Or why do we keep saying the same thing? Verbal core language sounds like this, like that in the story I told in the first segment mm-hmm. about the woman who said, "I deserve to die." Right. Well, how can a 24-year-old have this language, "I deserve to die"? Where would language like this come from? And yet, many of us carry language, "I'll go crazy. Mm-hmm. I'll be locked up. I'll do something terrible. I'll harm a child. I'll lose everything." And this language leads us, and I'll tell you why that is. When a trauma happens, clues are not just left behind in the DNA, but they're left behind in the form of emotionally charged words, sentences. They form a breadcrumb trail, and when you learn how to follow this breadcrumb trail, it can lead us back to a traumatic event in our family history, traumas that we may have biologically inherited from our parents and grandparents. So I help people in the book uncover this unconscious language, these unconscious words, and link it to the original trauma. And then it's like finding the missing piece of a puzzle that lets the whole picture come into view and then gives us a context to explain why we feel the way we feel. Mm-hmm. So you're taught in the book to become a detective of your own symptoms, your own behaviors, your own trauma language. There's certain questions in there that help you form what I call a core language map. And then I have you do a traumagram. And the traumagram is connecting these symptoms, these behaviors, these repetitions, this reliving, this verbal language, this trauma language to the events in the family history. And, one of the questions I ask in the book is, Chris, don't answer this, Chris, but Chris, what's your worst fear? If the worst thing happened to you, if things suddenly fell apart, things went terribly wrong, what's the worst thing that could happen to you? And then I tell the reader, this is probably a feeling you've had before all your life, before you had children. Because as parents, the normal feeling of something terrible will happen to my child, which is appropriate. We're parents. But I ask for that feeling even before you had kids. What's that feeling from your whole life, that if life suddenly went south, this thing would happen to you? And then I have people distill that answer down by other questions that I ask. And that's one of the questions I use to help people get to this trauma language. Now, you asked me an interesting question before about how do people know that they have inherited family trauma? And there are signs. There are definitely telltale signs. We might experience a fear or an anxiety or a symptom that strikes suddenly, that follows an event, or strikes suddenly when we reach a certain age, or when we hit a milestone in our lives. For example, we get married, or we go to have kids, or we move to a new place, or we leave home for the first time, or we get rejected by our partner. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, we have this series of behaviors or this series of language, trauma language, that starts to show up. I once worked with this woman. She was consumed with anxiety as soon as she became pregnant. And she didn't have much anxiety prior to that, normal amounts. But as soon as she's pregnant, she's consumed and miserable. And she shows up in my office. So I start to distill this fear, this anxiety, to this one fear that she'll harm her baby. And I ask her a question: had you ever harmed a child, a baby, your child? She says, no, never. That's my first child. No. And I asked, had anyone in your family ever harmed a baby? And she was about to say no. She said, oh my God, wait a minute. And then she tells a story of her grandmother, who was a young mother who let a candle caught the curtains on fire, caught the house on fire, couldn't get her baby who was sleeping upstairs out, and the baby died. And then the woman said, but we were never allowed to talk about it. And there you have why these traumas repeat. When traumas remain unresolved, or the healing is incomplete, or the people involved in the traumas don't talk about it, or the people involved are rejected or excluded, we often see aspects of this original trauma repeating, reliving, reappearing in subsequent generations.
Interesting. Wow, fascinating. It makes complete sense to me, because we can see the propensity of disease. Diseases will proliferate through generations. We've seen the genetic, linkage there. So this makes perfect sense to me from a logical standpoint when we talk about this. The other side of the coin is that what I alluded to earlier, which triggers this, is that it's not only trauma that we would inherit, but also we would inherit, I would imagine, other attributes as well.
Sure.
In a very positive way, I think that could be the case. If you come from a long line of we see generations handing on certain talents to the next generation, and so forth. I think that would also be
absolutely
applicable too. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and positive traits from the traumas. Right. As we talked about earlier, we develop a skill set from the very traumas, which make us stronger in some ways, and then more reactive and anxious in some ways.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the idea of the healing part is what's most critical. I think being able to identify the problem, first of all, and no one's going to come see you if they're having a wonderful life. They're fine.
You don't generally get it.
Yeah, it just doesn't happen. So someone comes to you with a bit of a traumatic problem and trying to address why these issues are there. You do the research, you find this little linkage, and then your job is to sort of unwind that and then rebuild that circuitry, so to speak, so that it manifests in new ways. Do you think that fathers who have been soldiers, or mothers nowadays, since they're allowed to be soldiers as well, would have this same sort of traumatic, would this come through to their children? Somebody returning from Afghanistan or Iraq?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the danger, the unmitigated, the unresolved, the unexpressed trauma that stays in its trauma brain, but the father or the mother hasn't gone through healing, can pass forward that propensity toward the trauma. For example,
go ahead.
Yeah.
Do you think that if a father has a traumatic experience, works it out to the best of his ability, then conceives, is that problem removed or not as powerful as it once was? Or maybe that's too...
It's interesting. There's a study just talking about what you're saying that's happened again at the University of Zurich, the Brain Institute, where mice were traumatized, but then they were given positive life experiences. I don't know how you give positive life experiences to mice.
Give them a piece of cheese.
Yeah, right. But they were given, placed in a very positive, uplifting, upbeat environment, and not only did the mice heal and stop exhibiting the trauma behaviors, but they also had less of a propensity to pass forward the traumatic experience to their offspring.
So it does seem to work. The sooner you repair it, the less the damage.
Absolutely, and that's the whole idea of we've got to change our brains. People always ask me, what do we do? And I kind of have three insights. That I like to tell people that, if we're struggling with something we can't explain, some depression, anxiety, OCD, we've got to shake the family tree and see what falls out. We have to see what family secrets have been hidden, or what trauma's never healed all the way, or what stories didn't get told. I also tell people that you've got to talk about these things.
Right.
We've got to tell our kids, because our kids may have no clue what's going on. Yeah, we've got to work through them so they're not passed down to future generations. But we also have to tell and bring relief to our kids that might be struggling without a clue as to why.
Yeah.
But thirdly, the most important thing is we've got to heal our brains. We've got to have new experiences.
When you're growing up as a child, we all do this. We use our parents as they have a reflective quality. We watch how they operate. We watch how they coexist. We see if they love each other. We can see them hugging and kissing. If they're fighting with each other, we see that as well. So some of our behaviors are learned through experience. And I'm wondering how that plays out with regard to your studies, because there is ability to learn trauma, not just inherit trauma, correct?
Oh, yeah. There's absolutely variables. Epigenetics is just one ingredient in the soup. But there's certainly what I see is unconscious loyalty to our parents and love. And as my great teacher Bert Hellinger would say, unconscious loyalty and blind love.
Blind love, unconditional love.
That furthers, Dad, Mom, that you shouldn't suffer alone. I'll suffer too.
Yeah.
Not a great strategy.
Yeah, it's fascinating in that regard, because you think about it, when we're watching our parents, we sort of mirror the way they are and pick up their tendencies. But I suspect that just by virtue of mathematics and genetics and the simple logic of the way we have evolved, that every one of us would have an element of some trauma embedded in us, simply because we have generations that have lived through wars. And the odds of us coming to that point in time would be pretty high, I think, just because, obviously there's more people. As there's more people, that would essentially become diluted, I think, over time. So but all of us would have a strain of that, correct? And that might explain our cultural evolution, our collective unconscious, our collective malaise, for lack of a better word, when we are faced with the way we're living our lives now, staring into phones and stuff. All those may be variants of a previous time, correct? I mean, this would be generational as well as individual.
Yes, let me make that point, generational as well as individual. So we can be reeling from the effects of inherited family trauma, but we can also be reeling from the effects of in utero trauma, or a break in the bond with our mom, let's say, or an experience very early when our mom and dad are fighting or separating, or there's a as they say, adverse childhood experience, ACE, which is very well studied. So we can be carrying the effects of inherited trauma as well as experiencing our own early trauma. But the most important thing, step 3, is we've got to have experiences powerful enough to change the brain, to override the trauma response that lives inside so many of us. We've either inherited or we have throbbing from childhood, this trauma brain, this throbbing amygdala in a sense, the midbrain.
Right. I mean, you think about environmental issues as well. I mean, if your mother lived through Katrina, or your mother lived through, the Fukushima tsunami, or the Japanese tsunami, those would all leave an imprint on a generation as well.
Very likely, yes. And then what do we do about it? Well, what we do about it, again, is we have to have new experiences that we then practice, the new feelings and the new sensations of the new experience, so that our brains can change. And these can be experiences of comfort or support. I focus a lot on that in my book, or experiences of compassion or loving kindness, or gratitude or generosity. Ultimately, anything that allows us to feel strength and peace inside. And then we've got to practice so we can steal traction away from the highly efficient trauma brain, the trauma cycle that keeps us in a state of suffering, and engage other areas of the brain, particularly, Chris, the prefrontal cortex, where we can integrate these new experiences, these new sensations, and then our brains can change. And that's one of the things I focus on in the book. I teach us how to have these new experiences so we can lay down new neural pathways, and our brains can change and we can heal.
And what are some of those steps? I mean, you mentioned, we talked briefly about EMDR, but you must have more elaborate steps once you identify how you retrain, or reburn those circuits, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, we've got to then have a new way of experiencing that trauma. So for where there was no support, let's say, for example, we had no support from our mom, we go into a practice where we give support to ourselves, or maybe garner support, gain support from her picture. For example, Mom has passed away, so we might put her picture over our left shoulder, and we might say, "Hey, Mom, when you were alive, there wasn't much happening, but now that you've passed away, could you come to me at night and hold me and help repair that break in the bond that we had, and teach me how to trust your love and how to let it in, how to receive it." Things like this, Chris. When we do this repeatedly, when we revisit the feelings and the sensations associated with a new experience that's positive, not only do the structures of our brain begin to wire together, but we can also stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, feel-good hormones like oxytocin and estrogen, even how our genes express, which is the part that interests me most, can begin to function in an improved way. So we've got to install these new experiences into our body. This is the most important thing. We've got a trauma. We've got to have a new experience strong enough to pull attention away from the trauma brain and bring engagement to the prefrontal cortex, like an experience of support or comfort. And then practice, focus, repetition. And this is how our brains change.
And then will then have a residual effect going down to the next generation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So this is sort of a broad, in many ways, this work that you've done and the brilliant research that you've encompassed really leads the pathway towards developing a larger pool of the collective subconscious, which would have, through the process of healing and repairing, can then reach a point where that is spread throughout the population, in a matter of speaking. I mean, we're always going to have difficulty in life, and we're always going to have to face hardship, and it's the degree to which we face hardship and how you come out of hardship. When I talk about my astrology clients, when they come to me, I say, we all have the potential for heartbreak and hardship in our lives. It's always there every day. It depends upon the response to that hardship is to the success of how you come out of it. So you have a choice of letting it take you down or a choice of letting it build you up. We do, because that potential is so real at that moment, we do have an option to go left or right.
That's why I wrote the book. Mm-hmm. I mean, right there, I wanted to provide help for people who struggle with the effects of inherited and family trauma, but they didn't know it. They didn't know where to turn. They have a depression they can't get to the bottom of. Yes. They have an anxiety or a symptom that strikes suddenly when they hit an age or they after a particular event. That's the key. Many of us live with a mystery we can't explain, and we're walking around thinking we're the problem, we're the cause. We think our own life experience is the source of our own suffering, and it isn't true. And I'm trying to wake people up to that idea that, no, you're not the source. Like the title of the book, it didn't start with you. Mm-hmm. Why don't you check into your symptoms and read and discover, find your trauma language, do your traumagram, have a new experience that can change your brain. You are not the source. It didn't start with you.
Do you think
the cycle?
Yeah, you changed the cycle. Do you think that a person who was the child of a criminal would become a criminal?
One or the other. Mm-hmm. For example, they can do three things. Nothing can happen, or they can continue the criminal behavior, or they can atone for their father's criminal actions. Mm-hmm. I've seen this a lot. Father commits a crime, son goes to jail.
Interesting. Wow, really interesting. Does this tie in at all with what Carl Jung thought of as the shadow? The sort of our shadow psyche. This is sort of our embedded dark side. We all have this, I suspect, at some point. And I know it probably varies per person. Not everybody, I suspect, has, but we probably all have a strain of something. I guess this speaks to depression, it speaks to insecurity, it speaks to self-esteem, it speaks to any number of different hidden sort of psychological attributes that we carry with us.
Jung even said himself that it was as though he carried a personal karma from his family history, that he felt as though he were solving the unfinished business of his family.
Interesting.
That's the epigram that I use.
Yeah.
In the beginning of my chapter 2, I think.
Yeah, I think it is. I think I saw that. The idea of karma in this in many ways, this whole theory that you're putting out there, in some ways explains karma, doesn't it? I mean, or not explains it, but at least puts it in a place where we can sort of wrap our heads around and say, there's really some meat here. This really makes sense.
Isn't that interesting?
It's just fascinating. And then karma's been around for as long as...
Yeah, so there's past life karma. I'm sure it's not an area I go into much. However, there's certainly family karma. Father or grandpa commits a crime, and my book is full of stories like this. Mm-hmm. And son or grandson carries the effects and pays the price.
Yeah. Do you see these kinds of examples occurring in people who are well-known, who are very well-known for something? In other words, do you think that Beethoven's parents or Beethoven's grandparents were great composers, or do you see sort of that same sort of quality carrying on? Or?
Yeah, I do. I often, the way an astrologer looks for the chart of someone famous when they notice a particular characteristic, I try to do the genogram of people where there's, but particularly when I see a crime, I'm curious as to what lived in the family prior that led to, the implications of this are amazing. If we could bring this work into the prison systems in
Oh
a
my
way
gosh, wow.
where we look at our prisoners and say, maybe you were at effect of what your father or grandfather did, and we could create healing on that level. Again, I wrote this book for all of these reasons. Also to generate awareness in the therapeutic community of the impact of epigenetics.
Yeah,
we can't just look at our childhood alone.
It is fascinating. As a devil's advocate kind of question,
Sure.
Does this offer people an excuse?
No, it offers people a absolute resource.
If someone acts out today, for example, just and they say, "Oh, I'm acting out this way because my grandfather acted out this way," it becomes a cop out. Is that
No.
Okay.
It doesn't excuse.
Okay.
It explains.
Explains.
Doesn't excuse, but it explains. Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just wondering. I mean, that's sort of just a devil's advocate kind of question to ask.
Yeah. No, it's a good question.
And
I say that's a sentence I use all the time. People want to hate their parents, and I say, look behind your parents.
Okay, do you think that people could use this as an excuse to sort of explain bad behavior, or account for that bad behavior in that regard? Because they say, well, I got it from my grandfather, I can't help it.
Yeah, no. It doesn't excuse at all, but it does explain, and that's helpful. Because many times we're at the effect of our own behavior, thinking that, well, why am I like this? And it'd be interesting to look for what sits behind our desire to take our life, our desire to harm another. It doesn't excuse. Certainly we're responsible for our own actions, but it can help to explain as to why we act the way we act, or why we feel the way we feel.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating discovery. We've been talking today with Mark Wolynn. He's the author of It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. Fascinating discovery, and I found it to be interesting because of the fact of the parallels I see in his work into the work that I do with astrology, because I see when a birth chart is cast, people have what we call difficult aspects in the chart. They sort of are indicators of perhaps a past trauma, and we talked briefly about the idea of karma, and they sort of they share a lot in common, although Mark's work is far more scientific and research in a different pattern. They do have parallels. And so it's been great to speak with you, Mark. Mark's book is called It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. His website is Mark Wolynn, MarkWollynn.com, and you can start the conversation there with him and perhaps reach out to him and understand perhaps why you may have a few, skeletons in your closet, so to speak. So thanks so much today for coming on, Mark. It's been great having this conversation. Really a fascinating subject and a fascinating area of research you've done. So my hat is off to you for taking this on.
Thank you. I enjoyed our talk quite a bit.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.